The early morning sun peeked through the tall windows of the penthouse that sat on the top floor of the city's most expensive building. Richard Cole, a self-made tech millionaire in his mid-40s, stood by the glass wall looking down at the city that had given him everything and taken away just as much. His phone buzzed. Without looking, he knew it was probably another business call. These days, that's all he got, calls about money, investments, and meetings. The excitement that once filled his days had slowly faded away after his divorce 5 years ago. As he turned away from the window, he noticed Anna, his housekeeper, quietly placing a stack of mail on the marble counter. Among the usual bills and business letters, a cream-colored envelope caught his eye. "What's this?" he asked, picking up the fancy envelope. The paper felt expensive between his fingers. Anna glanced up from where she was wiping down the countertop. "It came with the special delivery, sir. The courier said it needed your personal attention." Richard tore open the envelope, and his heart nearly stopped. Inside was an invitation with gold lettering. His ex-wife Olivia was getting married again, to Thomas Wilson, his former business partner and once close friend. The invitation felt like a punch to the gut. 5 years had passed since Olivia left him, claiming he cared more about his company than their marriage. Now she was marrying Thomas, the same man who had secretly been developing a competing product while working for Richard's company. "Bad news?" Anna asked, noticing how his face had darkened. Richard forced a smile. "My ex-wife is getting married. To my old business partner." Anna winced. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir." "Don't be," Richard said, tossing the invitation onto the counter. "They deserve each other." But as the day went on, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the invitation. Why had Olivia invited him? Was it to show off her new life? To rub it in his face that she had moved on with someone he once trusted? By evening, he sat in his home office staring at the invitation, a glass of whiskey in hand. The wedding was at the Grand Lake Resort, the same place where he and Olivia had gotten married. Another dig at him, no doubt. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Anna stood there with a tray of food. "You haven't eaten all day, sir," she said, placing the tray on his desk. "I made your favorite pasta." Richard nodded gratefully. In the 3 years that Anna had worked for him, she had learned his habits and preferences better than Olivia ever had. Anna was efficient, respectful, and kept to herself mostly. She was a single mother in her late 30s, working multiple jobs to put her daughter through college. Richard paid her well, but he knew she still struggled sometimes. As Anna turned to leave, Richard suddenly said, "Anna, wait." She paused by the door, looking back with curious brown eyes. "Do you think it's pathetic to go to your ex-wife's wedding?" he asked. Anna considered this for a moment. "I think it depends on why you're going. What if I go to show her that I'm doing fine without her? That her leaving didn't break me." "Then you're not really doing fine without her," Anna said carefully. "If you need to prove something, maybe you still care too much about what she thinks." Her honest answer surprised him. Most people in his life just told him what he wanted to hear. Richard looked at Anna properly for the first time in 3 years. She wore a simple blue uniform dress, her black hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wasn't conventionally beautiful like the women he usually dated, but there was a quiet dignity about her that he had never noticed before. A crazy idea suddenly popped into his head. "What if I didn't go alone?" he asked. Anna raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure you could find a date, sir. Many women would be happy to accompany you." "What about you?" The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Anna's eyes widened. "Me, sir, I'm your housekeeper." "Exactly," Richard said, warming to the idea. "No one would expect it. Olivia and Thomas would be completely shocked if I showed up with you as my date." "I don't think that's appropriate," Hannah said firmly. "And I'm not interested in being used to make your ex-wife jealous." Richard realized how his suggestion must have sounded. "I'm sorry, that came out wrong. I didn't mean to offend you." Anna nodded stiffly and turned to leave again. "Wait," Richard called out. "What if I made it worth your while? Your daughter's in her final year of college, right? I could help with her tuition." Anna stopped, her hand on the doorknob. He could see her shoulders tense. "It would just be for 1 day," Richard continued. "We'd attend the wedding, make a brief appearance, and leave. I'd compensate you generously for your time." Anna turned around slowly. "Why me?" Why not hire a professional escort? Because you're real, Richard said, and because they all know about my past relationships. No one would ever expect me to show up with someone like you. As soon as the words left his mouth, he realized how they sounded. I mean, someone who isn't from their social circle, he quickly added. Anna studied him for a long moment, and Richard felt like she could see right through him, past his wealth, past his power, to the lonely, bitter man underneath. I'll think about it, she finally said. Good night, sir. After she left, Richard sat back in his chair, surprised at himself. What had he been thinking, asking Anna to be his date? Yet somehow the idea felt right. Tomorrow, he would make her a proper offer, one that respected her dignity but would also make it worth her while. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of anticipation for what the next day might bring. The next morning, Richard woke up feeling embarrassed about his impulsive suggestion. He had asked his housekeeper to be his fake date to his ex-wife's wedding. What was he thinking? He got out of bed, showered, and dressed in his usual expensive suit, trying to come up with a way to take back his offer without making things awkward. When he entered the kitchen, Anna was already there preparing breakfast. She worked efficiently, her movements quick and precise as she flipped pancakes on the stove. For a moment, Richard just watched her, noticing how she hummed softly to herself while she worked. Good morning, he finally said, taking a seat at the island counter. Anna turned and placed a plate of pancakes in front of him. Good morning, sir. Coffee is almost ready. Richard cleared his throat. About last night, I want to apologize. It was inappropriate of me to ask you something like that. Anna poured him a cup of coffee and set it beside his plate. I've been thinking about your offer, she said, surprising him. Richard looked up at her. You have? She nodded, leaning against the counter across from him. How much would you be willing to pay? Richard nearly choked on his coffee. He hadn't expected her to actually consider it. My daughter Kelly needs money for her final semester and grad school applications, Anna explained. The timing of your offer is convenient. Richard set down his cup. I would cover all of her remaining tuition and application fees, plus extra for your time. Anna crossed her arms. And all I would have to do is pretend to be your girlfriend for one day. Just for the wedding, Richard confirmed. We'd arrive together, stay for the ceremony and part of the reception, then leave. Simple. I have conditions, Anna said firmly. First, I'm not pretending to be anything I'm not. If anyone asks, we tell them I work for you. Richard frowned. That defeats the purpose. We can say we recently started dating, Anna cut in. But I won't lie about who I am or what I do. Richard considered this. Fair enough. Second, Anna continued, no inappropriate touching or comments. This is strictly business. Of course, Richard agreed quickly. And third, she said, her voice softening slightly, I need this in writing. A contract that guarantees the money for my daughter regardless of how the wedding goes. Richard smiled. Smart. I wouldn't expect anything less. Anna finally returned his smile, just a small one, but it changed her whole face. Richard realized she had a dimple in her right cheek. I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork today, he said. Good, Anna replied. Now eat your breakfast before it gets cold. Later that afternoon, Richard sat in his home office with Anna, going over the details of their arrangement. His lawyer had sent over the contract, which Anna read carefully before signing. So, Richard said, leaning back in his chair, tell me about yourself. If we're going to pull this off, I should know more about you than just how you take your coffee. Anna looked uncomfortable. What do you want to know? Anything. Where did you grow up? What did you do before working here? What's your favorite movie? Anna hesitated, then slowly began to open up. I grew up in a small town upstate. My parents were factory workers. I got married young to my high school boyfriend, had Kelly when I was 20, and got divorced when she was 5. What happened? Richard asked, genuinely curious. Anna shrugged. Life. He found someone else, someone who hadn't given up on college to raise his child. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that impressed Richard. After the divorce, I worked whatever jobs I could find. Waitressing, retail, cleaning houses. When Kelly got accepted to university, I took on more work to help pay for it. That's when I started working for you. Richard nodded. And your daughter? What's she studying? Anna's face lit up. Pre-med. She wants to be a doctor. Pride shone in her eyes, and Richard felt a twinge of envy. No one had ever looked that proud when talking about him. What about you? Anna asked. I know about your company and your divorce. It was in all the papers. But what's the real story? Richard was taken aback. No one had asked him that in years. My company started in my garage, he began. I worked 18-hour days for years to build it. Olivia supported me at first, but as we got more successful, we grew apart. She wanted someone who would be home for dinner every night, who would take vacations and go to parties. I was always working. And your business partner? Thomas. Richard's jaw tightened. He was my friend. Or so I thought. While I was focused on our main product line, he was secretly developing a competing technology. When Olivia left me, he was suddenly there to comfort her. That must have hurt, Anna said quietly. Richard was surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice. It did, but the business betrayal was worse than losing her. They sat in silence for a moment, the afternoon sun streaming through the office windows. So, Anna finally said, if we're dating, how did it start? People will ask. Richard thought for a moment. We could say it happened gradually. You've worked here for 3 years. Maybe I finally noticed how amazing you are. Anna rolled her eyes, but he caught the slight blush on her cheeks. We'll need to be convincing, Richard added. These people are experts at spotting fakes. I'm a good actress, Anna assured him, but you'll need to stop looking at me like I'm your employee. How should I look at you? Anna stood up, smoothing down her uniform. Like I'm someone you can't believe you got lucky enough to be with. With that, she walked out, leaving Richard staring after her with newfound respect and the strangest feeling that this plan might end up being more complicated than he'd anticipated. The following Saturday, Richard took Anna to the upscale part of the city. The wedding was only 2 weeks away, and Anna needed a dress that would fit in with the high society crowd. She had protested at first, insisting she could find something suitable on her own, but Richard wouldn't hear of it. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right, he had told her. Now, as they stood outside an exclusive boutique with mannequins wearing dresses that cost more than Anna's monthly rent, she felt completely out of place. I can't wear anything from here, she whispered to Richard. These clothes aren't made for regular people. Richard placed a gentle hand on her back. Trust me, okay? Inside, a tall, thin woman with perfectly styled hair approached them. Her eyes quickly took in Anna's simple jeans and sweater, and her smile became tight. May I help you? She asked, looking at Richard rather than Anna. Yes, Richard said confidently. We have an appointment with Patricia. The personal shopping session. The woman's attitude changed instantly. Of course, Mr. Cole. Patricia is expecting you. Right this way. They were led to a private room with plush chairs and a small platform with mirrors. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted them warmly. Richard, it's been ages, she said, giving him a quick hug. And this must be Anna. Lovely to meet you. Anna was surprised that Patricia spoke directly to her, without the judgment the first woman had shown. I've pulled several options based on the event details Richard provided, Patricia explained, gesturing to a rack of dresses. Why don't we start with these? The next 2 hours were a blur of fabrics, colors, and styles Anna had never imagined wearing. Patricia was patient, offering suggestions but listening to Anna's comfort level. Richard sat in one of the chairs, giving his opinion when asked but mostly letting Anna decide. After trying on numerous dresses, Anna stepped out in a deep blue gown that flowed elegantly to the floor. It was simpler than many of the others, but had delicate beading around the neckline that caught the light when she moved. The color made her brown skin glow. Richard looked up from his phone and froze. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at her with an expression Anna couldn't quite read. Is it that bad? She asked nervously. Richard stood up slowly. No, he said quietly. It's perfect. Patricia clapped her hands together. I agree. You look stunning, dear, like the dress was made for you. Anna turned to look at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The dress hugged her figure in all the right places while still being tasteful. She had never owned anything so beautiful. It's too much, she said, looking at the price tag. We should try something else. Richard shook his head. This is the one. We'll take it. After the dress was carefully packaged, they continued their shopping trip. Richard insisted on buying Anna matching shoes, a small evening bag, and even took her to a jewelry store where he selected simple but elegant diamond earrings for her to borrow for the event. You don't need to do all this, Anna protested as they sat at a cafe for a late lunch. The dress is more than enough. Richard sipped his coffee. It's not just about the clothes, Anna. It's about making sure you feel confident walking into that wedding. These people, they can be cruel. I want you to be prepared. Anna studied him curiously. Is that why you're doing all this? To protect me. Richard looked uncomfortable. I'm doing it because it serves our purpose. You need to look the part. But Anna wasn't convinced that was the whole story. Over the past week, she had seen glimpses of a different Richard than the distant boss she'd known for 3 years. This Richard noticed things, like how she preferred tea over coffee in the afternoons, or how she always placed fresh flowers in the kitchen. This Richard asked about her daughter's studies and actually listened to her answers. Well, thank you, she said simply. I appreciate it. As they were leaving the cafe, they ran into a couple Richard knew. Anna could tell by the way his posture stiffened that these were people from his social circle. Richard, what a surprise, the woman said, and kissing his cheeks. We haven't seen you since the charity gala last spring. Linda, George, Richard nodded. Nice to see you. Linda's gaze shifted to Anna, curiosity and assessment clear in her eyes. And who is this? Richard hesitated for just a moment before placing his hand on Anna's lower back. This is Anna Williams, my girlfriend. The words sounded strange to Anna's ears, but she smiled politely and extended her hand. Pleased to meet you. Linda's eyebrows rose slightly as she shook Anna's hand. How lovely. How did you two meet? Before Anna could answer, Richard spoke. Anna worked for me first, actually. But things evolved. George laughed. Office romance, eh? Good for you, Richard. About time you got back in the game after Olivia. Anna felt Richard tense beside her at the mention of his ex-wife. We should get going, Richard said abruptly. We have another appointment. As they walked away, Anna noticed Richard's jaw was tight. You okay? She asked softly. They'll tell everyone, he said. By tonight, the whole social circle will know I'm bringing you to the wedding. Isn't that what you wanted? Anna asked, confused. Richard nodded slowly. Yes, but I wasn't prepared for how it would feel. Seeing their reactions. Their judgment, you mean? Anna said flatly. Richard stopped walking and turned to face her. I'm sorry. I didn't think about how this would affect you. Anna shrugged. I'm used to people looking at me that way. She started walking again. Richard caught up to her. You shouldn't have to be. They walked in silence for a while before Richard spoke again. There's one more stop we need to make. Where? Anna asked. My mother's house, Richard replied. If we're going to convince everyone we're a couple, you need to meet her first. She'll be at the wedding, and she needs to be prepared. Anna felt a flutter of nervousness. Your mother? Is that really necessary? Richard nodded gravely. Trust me, if my mother doesn't know about you beforehand, her reaction at the wedding could give everything away. Besides, he added with a small smile, she's the one person who might actually be happy to see me with someone new. As they got into Richard's car, Anna wondered what she had gotten herself into. Playing a girlfriend for one day was one thing. Meeting his mother and dealing with the judgment of his social circle was something else entirely. But as she glanced at Richard's profile while he drove, she found herself strangely curious about the woman who had raised him and the world he came from. And maybe, just a little bit, she was beginning to care what happened to him at that wedding. The day of the wedding arrived with perfect blue skies and a gentle breeze, weather as flawless as Olivia had always demanded. Richard adjusted his tie in the mirror, trying to ignore the knot in his stomach. He had faced business rivals and angry investors without breaking a sweat, but today felt different. Today, he would face the woman who had left him and the friend who had betrayed him. A soft knock on his bedroom door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, he called. The door opened, and Richard's breath caught in his throat. Anna stood there in the blue dress they had bought, her hair swept up elegantly with a few curls framing her face. The diamond earrings sparkled in the morning light. She looked nothing like his housekeeper and everything like the confident, beautiful woman he had glimpsed beneath the uniform these past weeks. "Do I look okay?" Anna asked nervously. "Your mother's friend did my hair and makeup. She was very kind." Richard's mother had surprised them both by warmly welcoming Anna into her home last week. Instead of the judgment Anna had feared, Mrs. Cole had been genuinely delighted that her son was finally moving on. She had even arranged for her personal stylist to help Anna prepare for the wedding day. "You look," Richard searched for the right word, "breathtaking." Anna smiled shyly. "You clean up pretty well yourself." Richard offered his arm. "Ready for this?" Anna took a deep breath and slipped her arm through his. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to the Grand Lake Resort took almost an hour. They rehearsed their story again, how Richard had gradually noticed Anna's intelligence and warmth, how they had started talking more personally after hours, how one dinner to discuss household matters had turned into something more. "Remember," Richard said as they approached the resort, "these people are experts at detecting weakness. If anyone says something hurtful, just squeeze my hand, and we can step away." Anna nodded, but Richard could see the tension in her shoulders. He reached over and gently touched her hand. "Hey," he said softly, "you've got this. You're the strongest person I know." Anna looked surprised by his words, but before she could respond, they were pulling up to the valet station. The resort was just as grand as its name suggested, sprawling grounds overlooking a crystal-clear lake, with the ceremony set up on the manicured lawn. White chairs were arranged in neat rows, with an elegant white arch covered in flowers marking where the couple would exchange vows. As Richard and Anna walked from the parking area toward the gathering guests, heads began to turn. Whispers followed them like a wave. Richard held Anna's hand firmly, silently letting her know he was there. "Richard Cole," a booming voice called out. A heavy-set man with a red face approached them, champagne glass in hand. "You old dog. I didn't think you'd actually come." "Hello, Phil," Richard replied with a forced smile. "Wouldn't miss it." Phil's eyes moved to Anna, widening slightly as he took her in. "And who is this lovely lady?" "This is Anna Williams, my girlfriend," Richard said, the words coming more naturally now. "Anna, this is Phil Burton, an old college friend." Anna shook Phil's hand. "Nice to meet you." Well, Phil said, his gaze moving between them with undisguised curiosity. "This is a surprise. I don't think anyone expected Richard to bring a date, much less such a beautiful one." Before either could respond, a slender older woman appeared at Phil's side. Her eyes narrowed as she looked Anna up and down. "Richard, darling," she said, air-kissing his cheek. "How brave of you to come." "Mrs. Harper," Richard nodded. "You remember my mother's charity work?" Anna helps organize her foundation events now. It was a small lie they had agreed upon, a way to explain Anna's presence in his life that wouldn't invite too many questions. "How nice," Mrs. Harper said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "Will you be sitting on the bride's side or the groom's?" Such an awkward position to be in. "We'll sit wherever we're assigned," Richard replied smoothly. "I'm sure Olivia planned everything perfectly, as always." As more guests arrived, the pattern repeated: surprise, curiosity, and often thinly veiled judgment. Anna handled each introduction with quiet dignity, but Richard could feel her grip on his arm tightening as the minutes passed. They found their seats near the back of the bride's section. A clear message from Olivia about where Richard stood in her life now. As they waited for the ceremony to begin, Richard noticed an older woman in the resort's service uniform staring at Anna with an odd intensity. The woman appeared to be in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a bun, and something in her expression made Richard uneasy. "Do you know her?" he whispered to Anna, subtly nodding toward the woman. Anna glanced over and frowned slightly. "No, I don't think so. Why?" "She keeps looking at you." Before Anna could respond, music began playing, signaling the start of the ceremony. Everyone stood as the groom and his groomsmen took their places at the altar. Thomas Wilson looked exactly as Richard remembered him, tall, handsome, with the same confident smile that had once convinced investors to trust their company. When Thomas's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on Richard, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. His gaze shifted to Anna, and his expression changed to something Richard couldn't quite read. Then the bridal march began, and all heads turned to watch Olivia make her entrance. She was undeniably beautiful in a designer gown that hugged her slim figure, her blonde hair arranged in an elegant updo beneath her veil. Richard waited for the pain of seeing her again, for the jealousy he'd expected to feel. Instead, he felt nothing. No ache in his chest, no burning regret. Just a distant acknowledgement that she looked nice, the way one might appreciate a pretty painting. As Olivia glided down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes briefly met Richard's. She faltered for just a moment when she noticed Anna beside him, her perfect smile slipping before she recovered and continued her walk to the altar. Richard felt Anna squeeze his hand gently. He looked down at her, surprised to see concern in her eyes. "Are you okay?" she whispered. In that moment, with Anna looking at him with genuine care, Richard realized something important. He hadn't come here to make Olivia jealous or to prove anything to his former social circle. He had come to finally close a chapter of his life and perhaps, just perhaps, to open a new one. "Yes," he whispered back, squeezing her hand in return. "I'm surprisingly okay." As the ceremony began, Richard found himself paying less attention to the bride and groom and more to the woman beside him, the woman who had entered his life as his employee but was quickly becoming something he hadn't expected, a friend. What neither of them noticed was that the older woman in the service uniform had disappeared, slipping away toward the kitchen with a determined look on her face and a phone clutched in her hand. After the ceremony, the guests moved to the resort's grand ballroom for the reception. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a warm glow over tables decorated with white roses and gold accents. A live band played soft music as waiters circulated with trays of champagne and appetizers. Richard guided Anna through the crowd with his hand resting lightly on her back. They found their assigned table near the edge of the room, another clear message from Olivia about Richard's place in the celebration. "Champagne," Richard offered, taking 2 glasses from a passing waiter. "Just one," Anna said, accepting the glass. "I need to keep my wits about me." Richard smiled. "You're doing great so far." Anna took a small sip. "Your friends aren't exactly subtle with their surprise." "They're not my friends," Richard corrected her. "They're people I used to socialize with because of Olivia. My real friends wouldn't care who I brought as my date." As they talked, Richard noticed the older woman from the ceremony standing near the kitchen doors, watching them again. This time, she seemed to be working up her courage to approach. "That woman is staring at us again," Richard said quietly. Anna turned slightly to look. "She's coming over." The woman approached their table slowly, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. Up close, Richard could see deep lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of a hard life. "Excuse me," she said softly, looking directly at Anna. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you related to a woman named Dorothy Williams?" Anna's eyes widened. "That was my mother's name. She passed away 10 years ago." The woman's hand flew to her mouth. "I knew it. You look just like her." She glanced around nervously. "My name is Harriet. I worked for the Harrington family for 40 years. I knew your mother when she worked here at the resort in the summers." Richard watched Anna's face carefully. She looked stunned. "My mother worked here. She never mentioned that." Harriet nodded. "In the early days, before she moved to the city, we were friends." She leaned closer. "Is there somewhere we could talk privately? There's something you should know." Anna looked at Richard uncertainly. "Go ahead," he encouraged her. "I'll be fine." Anna hesitated, then stood up. "We won't be long," she promised. As Anna followed Harriet toward a quieter area of the venue, Richard found himself alone at the table. He sipped his champagne, watching the celebration continue around him. Olivia and Thomas were making their rounds, stopping at each table to thank their guests. They were getting closer to his table, and Richard steeled himself for the encounter. "Richard." Olivia's voice broke into his thoughts. She stood before him in her wedding dress, Thomas at her side. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Richard stood up politely. "Congratulations to you both." An awkward silence fell between them. "Your date seems lovely," Olivia finally said, her tone carefully neutral. "How long have you been together?" "A few months," Richard replied, sticking to their story. Thomas cleared his throat. "It's good to see you moving on, Richard." The condescension in his voice made Richard's jaw tighten, but he kept his expression pleasant. Life has a way of working out for the best. Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly. Where is she from? I don't believe we've met before. The question carried an undercurrent that Richard recognized all too well. Olivia trying to place Anna within her mental hierarchy of who mattered in their social world. Anna runs my mother's charitable foundation now, Richard said smoothly. She's brilliant at it. How nice, Olivia replied with a tight smile. And before that? Before Richard could answer, a commotion across the room caught their attention. Anna was standing with Harriet near the bar, and Thomas's father, the elder Mr. Harrington, was approaching them with a thunderous expression. What is the meaning of this? Mr. Harrington demanded loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Harriet, I told you to stay in the kitchen. Richard immediately moved toward them, with Olivia and Thomas following close behind. Mr. Harrington, please, Harriet was saying, her voice trembling. She deserves to know the truth. What truth? Thomas asked, looking confused. Harriet turned to face Thomas. This is Dorothy Williams' daughter, your sister. A stunned silence fell over the group. Thomas stared at Anna in shock, while his father's face turned an alarming shade of red. That's absurd, Mr. Harrington sputtered. Harriet, you're fired. Leave immediately. No? Harriet stood her ground, years of deference suddenly gone. I've kept your secret for decades, but I won't anymore. Not when she's right here. Anna looked pale but composed. What is she talking about? Harriet took a deep breath. Your mother worked here one summer when she was young. She and Mr. Harrington had a relationship. When she found out she was pregnant, he paid her to leave and never contact him again. That's a lie, Mr. Harrington shouted. It's not, Harriet insisted. I was there. I helped Dorothy pack her things. I saw the money you gave her. She turned to Anna. I kept in touch with her for a while, but then we lost contact when she moved again. When I saw you today, it was like seeing her walk in all over again. Thomas looked between his father and Anna. Dad, is this true? Mr. Harrington's silence was more damning than any denial could have been. Olivia, who had been watching with growing horror, suddenly turned to Richard. Did you know about this? Is this why you brought her here? To ruin my wedding? Richard shook his head. I had no idea. Anna's voice cut through the tension. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I came here with Richard as his date. I knew nothing about any of this. Convenient, Olivia said coldly. You just happened to show up at our wedding. That's enough, Olivia, Richard said sharply. This isn't about you. More guests were beginning to notice the confrontation, heads turning their way. Thomas's mother had appeared at her husband's side, her face a mask of confusion and hurt. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere private, Richard suggested, placing a protective hand on Anna's shoulder. There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Harrington declared. This woman is making outrageous claims with no proof. Actually, Harriet said quietly, there is proof. She pulled an old folded photograph from her pocket and handed it to Thomas. This is your father with Dorothy that summer. Look at her, then look at Anna. Thomas stared at the photo, then up at Anna. The resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes, the same cheekbones, even the same dimple when they smiled. Dad? Thomas's voice cracked slightly. Mr. Harrington's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. It was a different time, he said weakly. Thomas's mother let out a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob, before turning and walking quickly away. Thomas looked torn between following her and staying to hear more. I think, Thomas said slowly, looking at Anna, that we have a lot to talk about. Anna nodded, clearly overwhelmed. Olivia stood frozen, her perfect wedding day crumbling around her. Then she turned on her heel and stormed off, ignoring the curious stares of her guests. In the chaos that followed, Richard kept his hand firmly on Anna's shoulder, a silent promise that he wouldn't leave her side. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And as the whispers spread through the reception hall, Richard realized that this wedding would indeed be remembered for years to come, just not for the reasons anyone had expected. The wedding reception had turned into complete chaos. Guests whispered and pointed as the wedding party scattered in different directions. Thomas's mother had disappeared into a private room with several friends consoling her. Mr. Harrington stood frozen near the bar, looking suddenly old and defeated. Olivia had stormed off toward the bridal suite, followed by her bridesmaids who shot angry glances back at Anna. Thomas, looking shell-shocked, suggested they move to a small conference room away from prying eyes. Richard, Anna, Thomas, Harriet, and a reluctant Mr. Harrington filed into the room. The tension was so thick it felt hard to breathe. "I think you owe Anna an explanation," Richard said firmly to Mr. Harrington once the door closed behind them. The older man sank heavily into a chair. "What do you want me to say? It was over 30 years ago." "The truth would be a good start," Thomas said, his voice tight with anger. "I just found out I have a sister on my wedding day. A sister you've kept hidden my entire life." Mr. Harrington looked at his son, then at Anna, who stood quietly beside Richard. "Your mother was beautiful," he finally said. "She worked here as a housekeeper during the summer season. I was less married than I should have been." Anna's hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. "My mother never told me about you. She said my father died before I was born." "She was protecting you," Harriet said gently, "and keeping her promise." "What promise?" Anna asked. Mr. Harrington looked down at his hands. "When she told me she was pregnant, I paid her to go away, to never contact me or tell anyone who the father was." Thomas made a disgusted sound. "You bought her silence." "It was a different time," Mr. Harrington repeated weakly. "No," Thomas snapped. "People have been doing the right thing for centuries. You chose not to." Hannah took a deep breath. "I didn't come here to disrupt anyone's life or ask for anything. I didn't even know about any of this." "Of course you didn't," Richard said, placing his hand supportively on her back. "Anyone who knows you would understand that." Thomas looked at Anna thoughtfully. "You really had no idea." Anna shook her head. "My mother died 10 years ago. She never talked much about her past." Harriet pulled another photo from her pocket and handed it to Anna. "She sent me this after you were born. She was so proud of you." Anna stared at the photo of her young mother holding a baby, her eyes filling with tears. "Why didn't you ever try to find me?" "I did years ago," Harriet admitted. "But you had moved, and I lost track. Then when I saw you today, it was like seeing a ghost." The door opened suddenly, and Olivia stormed in, her wedding dress rustling. Her face was blotchy from crying, but her eyes were fierce. "Is this what you planned all along, Richard?" she demanded. "Bringing this woman here to ruin everything?" Richard stood up straighter. "I had nothing to do with this, Olivia. And neither did Anna. Do you expect me to believe that? You just happened to bring the long-lost daughter of my father-in-law to my wedding." "Yes," Richard said firmly. "That's exactly what happened." "It's the truth," Anna said, looking Olivia in the eye. "I'm sorry your wedding day has been disrupted, but I didn't know any of this." Olivia looked at Anna with cold disdain. "And what do you want now? Money? Recognition? A piece of the Harrington fortune?" "Olivia," Thomas said sharply, "that's enough." "No, it's not enough." Olivia's voice rose. "Our perfect day is ruined because your father couldn't keep his pants zipped 30 years ago, and his mistake just walked through the door." Anna flinched as if she'd been slapped. Richard immediately stepped forward. "Don't you dare speak to her that way," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Anna is not a mistake. She's one of the most hard-working, honest, and kind people I've ever known." The room fell silent at the intensity in Richard's voice. Anna looked at him with surprise. Thomas broke the silence. "Richard's right, Olivia. This isn't Anna's fault." Olivia stared at her new husband incredulously. "Are you taking their side?" "There are no sides here," Thomas said wearily. "Just a family secret that's finally come to light." "Well, what are you going to do about it?" Olivia demanded. "We have 200 guests out there waiting for us to cut the cake and have our first dance." Thomas looked torn. "I don't know, Olivia. I just found out I have a sister. I need time to process this." "You can't be serious." Olivia's voice rose again. "You're choosing her over me. On our wedding day." "I'm not choosing anyone," Thomas said. "I'm just saying this is important." "More important than our wedding?" Olivia's eyes narrowed. "More important than me?" The way she said it made Richard suddenly recognize a pattern he'd been blind to in his own marriage. The constant demand to be the center of attention, the requirement that nothing, not work, not family, not personal growth, could ever be more important than her needs in the moment. He caught Anna's eye and saw that she recognized it too. "Maybe we should leave," Anna suggested quietly to Richard. "Let them handle this as a family." "You are family," Thomas said suddenly. "At least, I think you are." He turned to his father. "Is there any doubt? Any chance this isn't true?" Mr. Harrington shook his head slowly. "No, look at her. She has your grandmother's eyes, my mother's eyes." Thomas nodded, then looked back at Anna. "Then I'd like you to stay, please. I have a sister I never knew about. I'd like a chance to get to know her." Olivia made a sound of disbelief. "You can't be serious. We're supposed to leave for our honeymoon tomorrow." "Plans can change," Thomas said quietly. "Not these plans." Olivia's voice was shrill now. "Do you have any idea what I've put into this wedding? What my family has spent? Is that all you care about?" Thomas asked, a new note in his voice. "The money? The show of it all?" "Don't you dare turn this around on me," Olivia hissed. "I'm not the one with the secret sister crushing our wedding." Richard watched as Thomas really looked at his new wife, perhaps seeing her clearly for the first time. He recognized that look. It was the same realization he had years too late in his own marriage. "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that we need to finish this reception as planned for the sake of our guests. But afterward, you and I need to have a serious conversation." "About what?" Olivia demanded. "About what kind of marriage we're going to have," Thomas replied. "And whether family means the same thing to both of us." The room fell silent again. Richard felt Anna's hand slip into his, seeking support. He squeezed it gently, trying to convey that he was there for her, whatever happened next. "We should go," Richard said quietly. "No," Thomas said. "Please stay. Both of you." He looked at Anna. "We have a lot to talk about, and I don't want to lose this chance now that I've found you." Anna nodded slowly. "If you're sure." "I am." Thomas turned to his father. "Dad, go find Mom. She deserves to hear everything directly from you." He looked at Olivia. "And we need to go back out there and be the hosts our guests deserve." Olivia's face was a storm of emotions, but she finally gave a curt nod. "Fine, but this isn't over." As she turned to leave, Richard couldn't help thinking that for some things, like his marriage to Olivia, and possibly hers to Thomas, it might indeed be over. And maybe that wasn't such a bad thing after all. 6 months had passed since that fateful wedding day. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Anna walked across the university campus, her heart full of pride. Today was her daughter Kelly's graduation day, the very reason Anna had first agreed to Richard's unusual proposal half a year ago. So much had changed since then. Anna looked down at her hands, no longer rough from cleaning chemicals. The small diamond ring on her left hand caught the sunlight, still feeling foreign but wonderful. "Mom!" Kelly's voice called out. Her daughter rushed toward her in her graduation gown, cap slightly askew. "You made it." Anna hugged her tightly. "Of course I did. I wouldn't miss this for the world." "Is Richard coming too?" Kelly asked, looking around. "He's parking the car," Anna replied. And, she hesitated, Thomas said he might stop by later. Kelly's eyes widened. "My Uncle Thomas. Still feels weird to say that." Anna smiled. "I know. It's been an adjustment for everyone." That was an understatement. The weeks following the wedding had been a whirlwind of emotions and changes. The high society wedding had ended awkwardly, with the bride and groom putting on brave faces for their guests, while emotional storms brewed beneath the surface. Thomas and Olivia had left for their honeymoon as planned, but Thomas had cut the trip short after 3 days. He'd called Anna from the airport, asking to meet. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, he told her that his marriage to Olivia was over before it had truly begun. "She couldn't accept you as part of my life," he'd explained simply. "And I realized I couldn't build a future with someone who measures people's worth by their bank accounts and bloodlines." In the months that followed, Thomas had filed for divorce and reached out to Anna regularly, eager to build a relationship with the sister he never knew he had. It was strange at first, awkward and hesitant, but they had slowly found common ground, a shared love of old movies, the same distinctive laugh, identical expressions when deep in thought. Mr. Harrington had been more reluctant, but under pressure from his son and the gentle but firm insistence of his wife, who had surprised everyone by reaching out to Anna after her initial shock wore off, he had finally acknowledged Anna publicly. There was no grand announcement, no press release, just a simple dinner at the Harrington home where Anna was introduced as our daughter and Thomas's sister. "There's Richard," Kelly said, breaking into Anna's thoughts. Richard walked toward them, looking relaxed in casual clothes rather than his usual business suit. He changed too over these months, softening the hard edges that years of business battles had created. "Sorry I'm late," he said, kissing Anna's cheek before giving Kelly a hug. "Proud day, graduate. You ready to take on medical school?" Kelly grinned. "As ready as I'll ever be, thanks to both of you." Richard had kept his promise from their original agreement, paying for Kelly's education. But what had started as a business arrangement had evolved into something neither Anna nor Richard had expected. After the wedding, Richard had asked Anna to stay on at his home, not as his housekeeper, but as his guest while they figured out their next steps. Their pretend relationship had slowly transformed into a real one, built on mutual respect and genuine affection that had grown during their weeks of planning and pretending. "We should find our seats," Anna said, noticing other families heading toward the auditorium. As they walked, Richard took her hand, nervous about seeing Thomas. "A little," Anna admitted. "It's still strange sometimes, having a brother, especially one who grew up so differently from me." "He's lucky to have found you," Richard said simply. Anna squeezed his hand gratefully. Richard understood her complicated feelings about the Harringtons better than anyone. He'd been there through all of it, the awkward first meetings, the DNA test that formally confirmed what everyone already knew, the gradual building of relationships that had no roadmap or guidelines. Inside the auditorium, they found their seats near the front, reserved for families of honors graduates. As they settled in, Anna spotted Thomas entering alone, scanning the crowd. She waved, and he made his way toward them. "I made it," he said, slightly out of breath. "Dad sends his apologies. Mom's not feeling well today." Anna nodded, understanding the complex dynamics still at play. Mrs. Harrington had made more effort than her husband, but these things took time. "I'm glad you could come. It means a lot to Kelly." "Wouldn't miss it," Thomas replied with a smile that mirrored Anna's own. "My only niece graduating with honors. That's something to celebrate." As the ceremony began, Anna found herself reflecting on the strange path that had led her here. 6 months ago, she had been a housekeeper struggling to make ends meet, agreeing to a rich man's scheme to make his ex-wife jealous. Now she sat between her fiancé and her newly discovered brother, watching her daughter prepare to become a doctor. Life certainly had a sense of humor. After the ceremony, they gathered outside for photos. Kelly insisted on one with all of them together, Anna, Richard, Thomas, and herself. "My whole weird, wonderful family," she said with a laugh. As the photographer counted down, Richard slipped his arm around Anna's waist and whispered in her ear, "Best decision I ever made, asking you to that wedding." Anna smiled. "Even though your plan completely backfired." "Especially because it backfired," Richard replied. "I thought I wanted to make Olivia jealous. Turns out what I really needed was to find someone who reminded me what matters in life." "And what's that?" Anna asked. "Kindness, honesty, strength." Richard's eyes were serious now. "All the things I found in you." The camera flashed, capturing the moment, not just the image, but the feeling behind it. A family created not by traditional paths, but by chance, choice, and the courage to embrace unexpected change. Later that evening, as they celebrated at Richard's home, no longer a cold, sterile mansion, but a place that had gradually become warmer, filled with photos and personal touches. Anna stepped outside onto the terrace for a moment alone. The stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She thought about her mother, wondering if she had ever regretted her decision to keep Anna's father a secret. Had she been protecting Anna or herself or both? "You okay?" Richard's voice came from behind her as he joined her on the terrace. "Just thinking about my mom," Anna said, wondering what she would make of all this. Richard stood beside her, looking up at the stars. "I think she'd be proud of how you've handled it all. With grace and dignity, just like you do everything else." Anna leaned against him, grateful for his steady presence. When you asked me to be your fake girlfriend, did you ever imagine we'd end up here? Richard laughed softly. Not in a million years. But now I can't imagine being anywhere else. From inside came the sound of laughter, Kelly and Thomas getting along like they'd known each other all their lives instead of just 6 months. Should we go back in? Anna asked. Richard nodded, but before they turned to go, he took both her hands in his. You know, all those years with Olivia, I thought I knew what love was supposed to look like. It was supposed to be flashy and impressive, something that made other people envious. Anna waited, watching his face in the gentle evening light. But that wasn't love at all, Richard continued. Real love is quiet. It's in the small moments, making someone coffee just how they like it, listening when they've had a hard day, standing by them when the world turns upside down. Like you did for me at the wedding, Anna said softly. Like we've done for each other every day since, Richard corrected her. I may have started out with a scheme to make my ex-wife jealous, but I ended up with the greatest gift of my life. A second chance to get love right. As they walked back inside to join their unconventional family, Anna felt a sense of peace settle over her. Life rarely followed the path you expected. Sometimes it took unexpected detours that led to places far better than your original destination. And sometimes the person you were hired to pretend to love became the person you couldn't imagine living without.